I'm Jen Taylor Skinner, and this is the Electorette. On this episode, I have a conversation with Sondra Goldshein, the Executive Director of the Campaign for a Family-Friendly Economy. Their organization recently launched a $40 million campaign to support Democrats and elect candidates that support family-focused policies across battleground states. That includes childcare, elder care, family paid leave, and any policy that helps families. We talk about how electing candidates up and down the ballot who support these policies can transform the country. The Campaign for a Family-Friendly Economy has already demonstrated that investing in care policies wins elections. Take Virginia, for example. Their investment in that state helped flip the Virginia House of Delegates with a solid ground game focused on economic policies for families. So, please enjoy my conversation with Sondra Goldshein. Sondra Goldshein, welcome.
Thanks, Jen, so much for having me today. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, no, thank you for joining me on these. When I think back over the election cycles that have happened during my lifetime, I cannot remember an election cycle where issues related to what we refer to as the care economy were kind of front and center. They weren't really a core part of our political discourse, but I feel like in this cycle in particular, there's been a shift. There's been a shift in how Americans think about these things, and there's been a shift in relation to what we expect from our legislators in relation to this. Am I imagining that shift, or are we expecting more from legislators?
Oh, I think that's definitely true. And I think a big reason for that is recognizing that our economy is really not set up to support today's family. It's based on this outdated notion that one parent stays at home and one parent goes to work, and that children begin education at the age of 5. There's no system in place to help people afford to care for their loved ones at home, especially when they're aging or disabled. We've got astronomical childcare costs. It's really inaccessible. There's, I think it's about almost 75% of people don't have access to paid leave. And it causes people to really be forced to choose between caring for their loved ones and earning a living. And we know that this has disproportionate impacts on women who are usually the caregivers, the primary caregivers, and particularly women of color. So when we take that reality of what it's like to be working and caring for someone today, and we combine it with the economic outlook at the moment, right? We've got high costs of living that are really top of mind for voters this election. And although we hear a lot about high prices of groceries and gasoline, which we know, is certainly true, there is a really big part of nearly every family's budget that is driven by the high costs of childcare, the lack of affordable elder care, and the lack of paid leave. And this causes really what we would call a caregiving crisis in our country. And these really high costs force women in particular to have to choose between, earning a living and providing care, which is causing folks to take time off work or leave the job altogether. And so when you put those two things together and you have this expensive caregiving crisis and you have an election that's coming up where everyone thinks about economic issues, there is really an opportunity to create the political will for Congress to update that out-of-date system to make sure that all people can afford to care for their families and earn a living. And really, there's a lot of potential to use this election in particular to build the power to make change. We've got a set of issues that is really popular with the electorate. We've got a clear contrast between where the parties stand, with Democrats supporting this care agenda, which includes policies like paid family and medical leave, big investments in childcare and elder care, lowering the cost of prescription drugs, and Republicans spending their time focused on extreme measures like abortion bans. And so my organization, the Campaign for a Family-Friendly Economy, is going to spend the next 7 months helping voters connect those dots to win the key races that will elect candidates that are committed to delivering on these policies in the coming years.
So I know that the Campaign for a Family-Friendly Economy is investing a lot, right? And especially investing in candidates who support these care policies. And I'm curious as to what policies are within this scope, if you could just lay that out for me.
Absolutely. So these are policies that recognize that caregiving is basic infrastructures that help families and our economy thrive. So policies like paid family and medical leave, affordable childcare, home and community-based care for the aging and disabled. I think paid leave is something that is just so critical for folks to be able to take care of their loved ones and earn a living. Because the fact is that most working people in our country do not have paid leave, right? About 73%, to be exact, lack paid leave through their jobs. And so when illness strikes or a new baby joins the family, too many people are forced between taking time away from work to care for themselves or a loved one and paying the bills. And so this disproportionately impacts women who are often left with no option but to leave the workforce to care for their families. And that's why it's so important that we have legislation that creates permanent paid family and medical leave so families and businesses have the support that they need. The care agenda also includes ensuring access to affordable childcare. So, childcare in this country right now can cost as much as rent or a mortgage. And high quality childcare can be really, really hard to come by. And the pandemic really made visible what was already, such a challenge for working parents. We saw action on this, right? Congress passed funding in 2021 to stabilize the childcare industry, and this money helped childcare providers stay open, which in turn helped parents, particularly women, stay in the workforce. But this funding has recently expired, and it's left providers and families to pick up the pieces. There was research done by one of our partners at the Century Foundation, which put numbers on this, right? They project that 70,000 childcare programs can close as a result of the loss of this funding, which would cause more than 3 million kids to lose care. So we are really in a state of emergency around childcare. And again, this is a place where Congress and the president can step in and pass legislation that invests in our childcare system as part of basic infrastructure. President Biden has time and time again demonstrated his support of this care agenda by doing everything that he can do within his power. But it's really a place where we need Congress to act. And we've seen enough to know that a Republican led government isn't going to take this action to help women and families. They're more focused right now on taking women's rights away and corporate giveaways than addressing this crisis for women and families. And so at the Campaign for a Family Friendly Economy, we'll be working to help elect Democrats to ensure control of Congress and the White House so that we've got the majorities we need to pass what are really popular policies like paid leave and affordable childcare.
So when you lay it out like that, it seems like an easy sell, right?
Mm-hmm.
Democrats are saying things like, you deserve quality childcare, you deserve coverage for that, you deserve lower prescription drug prices, you deserve all of these things, right? But then you've got Republicans saying, hey, forget your golden years. We're going to raise the retirement age. You need to work till you're 70 or longer, and we're going to take away your health care. And by the way, if you've got some frozen embryos, if those accidentally get destroyed, you're gonna, go up the river for life for that. And
Yeah.
so the messaging just seems really stark. So I'm just curious as to, how do you craft a message to an electorate where this really stark contrast isn't already clear to everyone? I mean, what needs to shift in Democratic messaging to drive those differences home?
Right. So first, I'd say Republicans really have no shortage of examples of their extremist agenda right now. And I think, part of what the challenge is right now that even though President Biden and the Democrats have done a really good job steering the American economy through extraordinary challenges and putting working families first, folks don't know about it. And we really need to be more vocal about what the Biden Harris administration has accomplished. There is going to be a lot of noise as the election gets into full swing. And Republicans are only going to double down on those fear mongering tactics. And we, in turn, it's super critical. and why we at the Campaign for a Family Friendly Economy are really committed to ensuring that the work the Democrats have done to support working families is not drowned out. And so our political program is going to talk to voters about who really has their backs when it comes to the issues and policies that will benefit their families. And, as you know, the economy is always top of mind during elections, and voters are really looking to see which candidates are going to help them lower costs. So when we communicate with voters, which we do primarily through face to face conversations at people's doors and where they spend their time, we are really going to highlight that clear contrast between the candidates. That we've got a Republican Party today that's concerned with taking women's rights away, and a Democratic Party that is committed to lowering costs for families through their support of policies like paid leave and childcare and elder care. We find we've been running these programs in elections since around 2015, and we find that this message is really powerful across so many different groups. It works across race and place and age, across gender. Nearly everyone has an experience with caregiving and a challenge with earning a living and taking care of their loved ones. They're really popular solutions with broad swaths of the American public.
Right. And there's something that you said that's really important. You really can't beat, even though we're in 2024, you really can't beat old fashioned face to face conversations.
Hmm.
There are a lot of advantages to that. You can cut through the noise, the disinformation, the lies from the other side, frankly. Sometimes I stop and think about how surreal this political moment is, in that we're not in a place where Democrats and Republicans are discussing philosophical differences in how to approach caring for families and working people, right? One party saying basically you're on your own, right? And we're going to make it harder and shrink what you already have. And I don't think we appreciate the fact that this is a really scary place for a lot of Americans to be. And I think that, having those face to face conversations really drive that home.
So face-to-face conversations are really powerful. There's a ton of misinformation out there, and like you said, this is not top of mind. People are not thinking every day in political terms. And they're also, when they're not always quite sure what the difference is between the parties. And so by having a conversation with our trained canvassers, we can really connect the dots for people and drive home the difference between candidates and who's going to lower costs and put money back in their pockets, and who is not. Brings up for me a story that I recently heard from one of our canvassers who has been knocking on doors in Montana, right? Montana is a place where there is a really important Senate race that will help decide who controls the Senate after the election. And our canvasser spoke with this woman named Shelley, who had just gotten a fantastic job offer in Chicago that would help her career. But in order to take the job, she would have to leave her aging parents back in Montana. And there was a real lack of affordable at home nursing options. And so she's forced to choose between her own livelihood and taking care of her parents, which is honestly a decision that no person should have to make. And so, we have this conversation with her, and we're able to talk about Senator Tester's record on supporting, the policies that provide working families with the tools and opportunities they need to build a good life. And we're going to have conversations like that over and over and over again. I know that if somebody would knock on my door and talk to me about what was top of mind for me right now. I'm talking to you from my bedroom, right? Like healing after breaking my knee last week.
No.
And the only way that I'm able to keep working right now, and my kids are able to get back and forth to school, and honestly, I probably could say this any day of the week, really, is through a combination of my family and paid caregivers who make all of this possible. And so it's these, we call these, it's these kitchen table economic issues that are really top of mind for folks. And the reason why programs like ours can make a huge difference is that we're out in the field, we're talking to folks, we're hearing what their individual challenge is, and then we're able to frame the conversation to highlight what the difference is or what their elected official has done in order to help make their life better. And I think the key way that we talk to folks that can be empowering, and we use this awesome bunch of research from a group called the Winning Jobs Narrative, is to recognize that people are the heroes in that story, right? Like it's people, it's individuals, it's you and I who are working to take care of our families. And it's the government that provides us with those tools and opportunities so we can earn a living and we can take care of our loved ones. And so it's a really powerful way of talking about, the difference between candidates, and it just leads itself naturally to a contrast because you've got one party. I also, just one more thing, I think back to when Donald Trump was first running for election. Somebody asked him a question about childcare, and he's like, "Oh, companies can really easily offer childcare to employers. All you need are some swings and some toys." So that, right? That is not what this is. He even said, like, "Surely this is not expensive, is it? We can do this easily." No, it costs money, right? And it takes time and expertise, and it is necessary infrastructure for our economy to function. And so there's a real clear contrast between the candidates. And that's our work, is to talk to folks as many times as possible, as early as possible, and through as many channels as possible. Because we've got a message and we've got a set of policies that will make a difference. It's just incumbent upon us to really highlight that for voters.
Right, that's a really great example.
Yes.
To show that, I mean, he really doesn't think, I don't know. I mean, it's a fantasy to think that he actually thinks about working families or any family at all, honestly.
Yeah, and when you think about, like, one of the champions in the Senate is like Senator Patty Murray, and at one point Senator Patty Murray was one of two women in the Senate, and she's really the driver on childcare. And part of the reason why elections are so important is not only to create that, like, showing that this is part of how you win, right, like an election, but it's also to get other people in decision making seats. Because I'll tell you, when Patty Murray first started out, she was not surrounded by other people who remember, right, or who had experience trying to juggle all of this, right, caregiving and earning a living. And and now, right, when we're in elections, we're also looking to diversify who represents us so they can bring the same real world experiences we're pulling on at the doors. Our elected officials should also be pulling on from their own personal experience.
Yeah, Patty Murray is my senator. I'm very proud of her.
Ah,
In Washington State, right?
yes, a true champion for childcare, for sure.
And, speaking of connecting the dots, I think that's really important because I think oftentimes people can more clearly understand the implications of a political choice when they can envision some material gain in their own lives. Otherwise, it's just kind of an abstract, kind of meaningless thing. You gave Montana as an example. I know you have some
Yes.
other battleground states on your agenda, but I was thinking specifically, I was looking at Georgia because I think Georgia is another battleground state that you're focused on.
Mhm.
And I was looking at the median annual income, I think, is around $40,000 in Georgia, right?
Mhm.
And at the lower end, if you're making close to minimum wage and you're a single parent, that puts you about $20,000, which is really, really low, right? But the childcare costs in Georgia would mean that you're spending roughly like 40% to 80% of your take home pay on childcare. And that's just unaffordable. It's unreachable for a lot of people.
But I was hoping you could give me an example of another battleground state where focusing on these issues really helped energize voters.
So we just ran a program in Virginia where the Virginia state legislature was, is all up for reelection in odd years. And there was so much at stake in that election. And so we really wanted to be out there talking to voters about where the candidates that in the races that we were involved with stood on issues like that. And on so many of the doors we knocked, the stories that we heard were really about childcare, right? There's this childcare cliff that we had just approached, where all of this funding that the American Rescue Plan had poured in to stabilize in the sector was expiring. And we knew that many providers had been forced to raise rates, reduce their services, or close. And there had been families who had been given days or weeks to find new childcare providers as the centers were forced to close. And so in those conversations, and when we asked folks, like, we had at the doors, when we asked folks, like, what's on your mind? What are the financial challenges that you're facing right now? We heard time and time again that the lack of affordable or accessible childcare options were top of mind. And story after story about how folks were scaling back their hours to be able to pick up their kids from daycare earlier, or even needing to leave the workforce, or grandparents making moves so that they're able to lend more support for their kids so they can keep working and help take care of their grandkids. So, this is like a policy that you can read about in the newspaper and has really shocking numbers, right? About the number of kids that will ultimately lose spots and the number of centers that are ultimately going to have to close. But then when you're talking to folks at the door, you see it in a really personal level. My childcare center has closed. We work with this wonderful provider in Virginia who was having to make a really hard choice about whether to keep a center open. That they had been able to use funds from the American Rescue Plan to open. And so you have these policies and these decisions that are being made in Washington, D.C., in Congress by lawmakers, and then real consequences on the ground. And then candidates who have completely opposite reaction to this. So, for example, in Congress, there is something called the Child Care Stabilization Act, which would stabilize the industry to make up for the funding that had sunsetted. And there's not a single Republican sponsor on that legislation. And so when we are going to be out in the field in the coming election, we'll be talking about how Democrats are supporting stabilizing the childcare sector and helping make all of this work for families, while Republicans are basically ignoring and turning their back on working families.
Virginia is such a great example because I know that you put a pretty sizable investment in Virginia, and you were able to, and this was in 2023, I think,
Yes.
flip the Virginia House of Delegates and basically kind of neutralize Glenn Youngkins, who won the gubernatorial race, to kind of neutralize his extreme agenda, right?
Yes.
So that's a good example. That's something that you can apply across the country in other states.
Yeah, we launched about a $500,000 campaign to help Virginia Democrats flip the House of Delegates and keep control of the Senate. We knew that there was so much at stake in the 2023 election, right? Glenn Youngkin, Virginia's governor, supports abortion bans, and a Republican-controlled legislature would almost certainly deliver him one to sign. And then that's just being on defense. On offense, we had also been working for many years on passing a state paid family and medical leave policy in Virginia, which stood no chance if Democrats didn't control both chambers. And so, like we do in every election, we look for the geographies that have a real density of base and persuadable voters. And then we got out into the field. And in this one geography, we knocked on more than 53,000 doors, and we had about 2,500 conversations, educating voters about where the candidates stood on the issues that mean the most to working families, including affordable childcare and paid leave, access to abortion, and more. And we were able to help, elect Delegate Josh Cole, who was a key part of flipping that house. So that's why we do this work, right? It's the policy outcomes that we're looking for. So now there is not an abortion ban that can be passed in Virginia, which is critical for access to abortion all over the South. And not only that, but after years of hard work by us and our partners, a state paid family and medical leave bill has been sent to the governor's desk. And that also forces him to act where he has put his, he talks a good game about looking out for Virginia families, but here's a real concrete way to do that. And, we shall see. But this is all only possible because of electoral programs who change who's in office and what they are prioritizing.
So what other states are on your radar?
So this year, the Campaign for a Family-Friendly Economy is going to run our largest ever political program to make sure that we reelect Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, and that we put Democrats in control of Congress. And we will be focused on the battleground states where our kitchen table economic focus and our large scale field program can make a big difference in the outcome of the election. And we are going to be in states like Wisconsin and Ohio, Pennsylvania, Georgia, New Hampshire, Montana, Virginia, and Michigan. We're in these battleground states because it's those states that are going to decide who wins the presidency and who controls Congress.
So I know the Biden administration has proposed a budget for fiscal year 2025, and a lot of that budget is focused on the issues we've been talking about, right? Focused on families, working families, childcare, etc. Do we know specifically what's in that budget?
Yes. So I really think, what's the saying? When you look at a budget, you can really see where somebody's values are.
Yeah.
So this budget was a strong signal of how committed Democrats are, and President Biden in particular, to working families. So we see about $325 billion for the paid family and medical leave program. We see $150 billion to increase access to care for the aging and disabled, over $420 billion to make childcare more affordable, and an additional investment in a universal pre-K program. So President Biden is doing everything he can. And we've got to help deliver a Congress and reelect the president so that we can make these things a reality.
As we get deeper into the election cycle and closer to the November election, what can listeners, voters, and the electorate do to help bring this vision to life?
Yeah, I think for starters, vote, right? Like vote for candidates that you know will fight for policies that help women and working families, and vote out those candidates who are prioritizing extremist agendas. That would be number one. Number two, I think it's really important to have conversations with your friends and family about what's at stake in this election. And that includes electing leaders who support policies like paid family and medical leave and affordable childcare. That's during the election time. But it's really important also that folks talk to those who represent them in Congress, so they hear from you all year round. Because electing someone who says they're going to support this issue is just step one. Step two involves holding them accountable to what got them elected in the first place. And I just want to encourage everyone, not to get disheartened. Like politics can be exhausting and it can be frustrating, and that's really true. But something that really keeps me going is to think about what's at stake in the election for women and working families, and how important your vote can be to changing the reality for them in this country.
Right. I mean, it seems like an obvious solution, right? But, and I think there's been a lot of cynicism around voting and what it could possibly do. But the thing is that everything that we have that's good in this country came through people exercising their right to vote, right? Speaking at the ballot, exercising their civic duty. And I think that we should not underestimate that in getting the world that we want.
Absolutely. The only way to change the policy outcomes, the world that we want, is by changing who's in office and what they're prioritizing. And there could not be a clearer difference right now between the two parties and the worlds that they want. And so we're going to do everything we can to reelect President Biden and Vice President Harris and to deliver those majorities in Congress so that all of the policies that we've been talking about today can be a reality for all Americans.
So I'll just, close by saying this. I was, speaking of Patty Murray, I was thinking about childcare in my own state, in Washington State. In preparation for this conversation, I was looking up what the childcare costs were in the state. And we are, surprisingly, I found out, Washington State has the third highest childcare costs in the country. I think we're, behind DC and Virginia, which has the highest childcare costs in the country. And if you had asked me, years ago, if I could envision something different for myself, and I probably would have said, childcare costs, it's just expensive. This is just what it is, right? And I think a lot of Americans view our situation through that lens, right? That there's some things that are just kind of out of reach, some things are just expensive, and that just is what it is. But, if everything comes to fruition, right? If we get these candidates in office, if we get the White House and we have congressional majorities, what do you envision? What kind of world do you envision for Americans?
Yeah, so at CFFE, we envision a world where everyone can take care of themselves and their families and also be economically secure. I think one of the things that we really have to tackle, and I own this also personally, is that taking care of your family and earning a living is not something that you can or should have to do by yourself. If the one thing I have learned from all of these conversations that we've had at the doors and listening to people's personal experience is that we collectively are all facing the same challenges. And that means that it should not be on an individual's shoulder to have to address those yourself if it is something that is a challenge for all working people. And so if I could fast forward, 10 years, it would be that we've got the infrastructure in place that thinks about caregiving the same way that we think about our bridges and our roads and our transit system, that it is something that we need in order for people to be able to work and to earn a living. And honestly, the reason why people work and earn a living for the most part is to take care of their families. So to really help all of us, myself included, get to a spot where we are demanding that our system in this country be updated. That, to me, is what we need to do in order to get to the world that we want.
Yeah, I really, really hope we get there. Sondra Goldshein, thank you so much for joining me. This has been a really great conversation, and thank you. Just thank you for taking the time to talk to me.
Oh, thank you so much, Jen. I really enjoyed it.